No, I don't mean to do that, but anyway, go ahead. Okay. Right. Okay, absolutely. That is a great question, by the way. That's a great question. Because I don't mean to imply that any more than with the acorn. It doesn't become an oak tree in a vacuum. It has to have certain physical nutrients. It also has to not have certain things like a squirrel that eats it. Do squirrels eat it? I just made that up too. It's like they don't even eat squirrels, you idiot. They bury them. Okay, well, whatever they do. Does anything eat acorns for that matter? Or step on them and crush them? So there's a lot of things that have to fail to happen for it to become an oak tree. And there's a lot of things that have to happen for it to become an oak tree. But even with the acorn, it's just a cause and effect physical thing, right? And I only used it as an analogy because with human beings, you have an additional rational element whereby because of our reason, we intersect with other human beings that sculpt our character, and we intersect with our environment, and we make choices. And so, making bad choices develops bad habits, which develop bad character. So by the time you're an adult, if you've been making bad choices all along and you haven't been disciplined by parents, you grow up to be criminal. Because it's like taking a tree and just bending it over as a sapling, and then as it grows, it'll end up growing crooked. It's an analogy to the human soul, where we're supposed to have inputs from our fellow human beings. And then, of course, as Christians, then it gets even more interesting, because now we have the Holy Spirit in us who comes into us when we get saved, and then we're supposed to be discipled by other Christians who are our leadership to sculpt our character and our souls so that we become a person of virtue, whatever that means. It would be, things like faithfulness and courage and fidelity and familial love and these things. And by the way, you weren't necessarily asking this, but whatever your thoughts are about this, this is our heritage. This goes back 2,500 years as a conversation. It's not something that, in this, again, you weren't asking this, but it's not something that somebody just yesterday, or even as recent as Thomas Jefferson, just stepped up to the mic and started talking. Right or wrong, this is our heritage, and it serves us well to become informed. Well, how have we understood the human experience? Not only biblically, but how have we understood it in the broader context of just our raw humanity? It's incredibly, incredibly rewarding, I think, endeavor to study. And I'm over time. Thank you. Why am I clapping for me? That was terrible. I just clapped for me. I don't have a good character. That's what this means.
Thank you, Dr. Now, we're going to take a short break.
Don't say short around me. Sorry, I'm just real sensitive about that word.
We're going to take a break.
A brief.
Water's been provided, coffee's been provided. I'll be back here in just a few minutes.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you guys for coming out today. I work for an organization called Life Training Institute. I get to travel around the United States and a little bit around the world talking about what we're going to be talking about today. Dr. Howe's talk actually dovetailed rather nicely into mine. There are things that we'll be building on from what he talked about, is from some of the natural law arguments and the idea of the value of human life. The main focus of my talk today will be on the issue of abortion, but we're talking about the case for life and making a case that human life has value by virtue of what it is. Why would I want to talk about this for a living? Why would anybody do this for a job? Because I promise you, it is not the most exciting thing when people see me coming. Often I go to universities all over the United States. I've spoken at Harvard, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I've spoken at Auckland University in New Zealand. And oftentimes, as of just a couple of days ago, I was in Memphis speaking at a high school, Benedictine in Arbondale. And before I got there to speak at about 2:30, I was in the office waiting to go in. And they said that when they heard that I was coming, there'd just been a rash of parents calling up the school to get their kids out because they were afraid to hear the presentation that I was going to give. People in our culture do not want to talk about what we're about to discuss today. It is one of the least pleasant conversations that people have. That's why I have the job that I have. That's why I get to do what I do. I travel around the United States and the world, and I equip people to discuss this controversial issue, or the idea of the value of human life, hopefully in a way that doesn't degenerate us into the worst versions of ourselves. That doesn't make us something that we don't want to be, because that's what usually happens. That's why those people were taking their kids out of school. I've actually been speaking at churches where right before I got up to speak, they said, if there are any children in the audience, get them out. And there's like this mass exodus of people running for the doors. I'm like the only guy in ministry that I know that the children run in fear from before he gets ready to talk. But that's because we're terrified of this issue, and we should be. Oftentimes I talk to people and all around the country, they'll say this, and Mr. Watts, I wish I could talk about my convictions on this issue. I wish I could talk about what I believe. But what happens is I get into conversations with people, even people that I love, even family members, and we start yelling at each other, and it becomes ugly and divisive. And I know what it's like. Because I used to be a pro-choice atheist. I used to be on the other side of this. When I was in college and all through university and into my early 20s, I wasn't just an atheist, I was a hostile atheist. And I wasn't just pro-choice, I was outspokenly pro-choice. And so I know what it feels like to be on the other side of this issue. And I understand why people don't like to talk about it. And I've seen how people can, believe me, I live in this world. I have seen what happens, and people on both sides hate each other. People on both sides actually raise the level of violence of each other, and people on both sides will kill each other. I was just in Washington, D.C. recently, and I was in Austin after that. And as I came into Austin, I was met by a guy at the airport, and he said, there was a group here called Stop Patriarchy here just a couple of days ago. Have you heard of them? So, well, no. So they're a pro-choice organization. And they actually advocate for violence against people like you. They say it's a just thing to do for society to kill people like me who go around and talk about this issue. And so I know how awful the issue is, but here's the thing. We have to talk about it. We can't set it aside, and here's why. Building off of what Dr. Howe said earlier, this is objectively one of the most important moral issues of our age. There's no way around it, by the way. It's objectively one of the most important moral issues of our age, no matter which side you're on. Let's say for the sake of argument that people like me who hold the pro-life position are correct. Let us say that human beings have value by virtue of what they are, not what they can do, not instrumental value, but we are valuable by virtue of what we are. And so the unborn are valuable human beings. And we have basic duties and obligations to them, the same that we would have to any other human beings, not the least of which is just not to kill them, to allow them to continue to live. Well, if that's true, stipulating that for the sake of this conversation, then we live in a time where the destruction of human life is happening on a scale the likes of which this world has never seen before. The world has never seen anything like it, if they matter. In the United States alone, since 1973 and Roe v. Wade was passed, there have been more than 56 million abortions in the United States alone. In China, since 1971 and the one-child policy was enacted, as of 2012, not even as of today, as of 2012, there have been more than 336 million abortions in China alone. In just those two nations, that number is greater than the population of the United States and twice that of Australia combined. If they matter, we are seeing entire nations of human life wiped from the face of the earth. More than 40 million a year worldwide, more than 1 billion in the last 30 years worldwide. If they are human, if they matter, the world has never seen anything like this. We are destroying human life on a scale that far outweighs the wars of our worlds. Far outweighs the wars. By far, if they matter, it's an unimaginable injustice. But what if they don't? What if the pro-choice side is right? Well, it doesn't become nothing as a virtue of that. And actually, it's still objectively one of the most important moral issues of our age, because there's people like me all over the world, not just here in the United States, all over the world. We have as a ministry invitations to more than 22 nations around the world, because this is not just an American argument, it's happening everywhere. And the world wants to talk about it, and there's people like me traveling around the world, raising up the emotions of people, raising up their consciences, trying to get them involved in their political processes. And here in the United States, every presidential election, every Senate election, every legislative election, every Supreme Court nomination, even charitable giving, every aspect of our life is this issue. It touches it. And I'm interfering and trying to get other people to interfere in the free choices that women ought to be able to make, a private medical decision to have a procedure that has no greater moral component than a tooth extraction. It simply doesn't matter at all. And yet I am helping raise and a part of an effort that raises billions of dollars worldwide to get people involved in an effort to stop people from doing something that just doesn't matter at all. There is no way to look at it that the issue isn't important. There's no way to look at it that it isn't objectively one of the most important moral issues of our age. But it is an issue that we don't want to talk about. So the solution is not to set it aside and ignore it. We can't do that. The solution is to learn how to talk about it well. Learn how to talk about the value of human life. Learn how to talk about our basic moral intuitions. Learn how to talk about the differences of opinion that we have in a way that produces productive dialogue and hopefully impacts people as opposed to making them our enemies. Well, how do we do that? I suggest we do it by three ways. The first way is that we simplify the issue. The second is that we're going to argue using science and philosophy. And the third is that we learn to argue well, respecting the people in front of us and respecting their opinions and being willing to listen to them and hear them, even when they say things that we find deeply offensive. So number one, we simplify the issue. What do I mean by simplify the issue? We simplify the issue by trying to focus in on what the argument that I'm offering today means, that what makes abortion wrong. Why would abortion be wrong if it is wrong? And that is not a morally complex issue. People say a lot to us when I'm talking to them. They say, abortion is very morally complex. I want to suggest to you that it is not morally complex. And the question of the value of human life and what we do to other human beings is not terribly morally complex. Where it comes down to, and as I said, this builds on what Dr. Howe was talking about, is how we answer one question. One single question. What are the unborn? What are the unborn? How does that matter? Let's say there was a story that a doctor by the name of Christopher Kaiser, who's a Catholic scholar out at Loyola Marymount, tells, and I share this story and I personalize it a little bit. On December 25th, 1992, I was traveling from my mother's house in the north part of Atlanta, in an area called Marietta and East Cobb, traveling down to an area of Atlanta called Buckhead. I'm a child of divorce, and so I'm leaving my mother's house. I'm going to my father's house. I was in college at the time. I spent Christmas morning with my mom. I spent Christmas afternoon with my dad's family. So on the way to my grandmother's house, there's an accident that happens, and there's a life that's lost in that accident. There was nothing that I could do to prevent it. There was nothing I could do to stop it, but there's no doubt that there was innocent. There's no question that a life was lost in the midst of that accident. And it troubled me deeply for a couple of hours. And then I got to my grandmother's house, and I ate some bacon, which I love, and I drank some Coke, and I opened up some Christmas presents, and I forgot all about it. I didn't let it ruin Christmas. It wasn't something that just overwhelmed me for the rest of my life. There's an important piece of information missing from that story, isn't there? What was the nature of the life that was lost that day on the way to my grandmother's house? Now, I've been all over this country, and I can tell you that squirrels act different in different regions of the country. And in Georgia, they're a bit suicidal, and they run out in front of the car, and you try to avoid them, and they seem to throw themselves up under your wheel. And I was trying to avoid it because I don't want to kill a squirrel. I don't want to kill it on any day, but especially Christmas. I don't know why Christmas matters to the squirrel, but it matters to me. And so I hit the squirrel, and I see his little body spinning in the road, and you can understand why it bothered me, because I love animals. I was like, I don't want to kill a squirrel. It's awful. And I got to my grandmother's house, and I was like, this is awful. But you also understand why when they gave me bacon, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, I love bacon, and she gave me Coke, and I opened up some presents. I forgot all about it. They didn't let the squirrel ruin Christmas. I didn't sit around weeping about it all day. As Christopher Kaiser points out, I don't know how many insects I have ever killed in any drive that I have ever taken. I know when I drive through Florida, it's like Armageddon for insects because they blow up all over my windshield on the way to Disney World. But nobody in the car ever starts screaming and weeping and wailing about the death of the insects because we simply don't care. We recognize that it's a different life that's going on there. We think it's gross, it's disgusting, get it off our windshield, but nobody's upset about the insects dying. But what if, on the way to my grandmother's house, I had hit a human child, even by accident. And then I told you, I got to my grandmother's house, I ate some bacon, I drank some Coke, I forgot all about it. I said, I may have killed a kid, but I didn't let it ruin Christmas. I mean, I got over it. It wasn't like I sat around weeping all day. It didn't bother me for the rest of my life or anything. Well, you would judge me if you heard me say that. And I think rightly, you would rightly judge that I didn't understand something that had happened that day. I didn't understand the nature of the life that was lost that day, its importance. I was missing an important aspect of it because we understand that there's a difference in the value of human beings and the value of squirrels and the values of insects. We may not be able to articulate why we understand those things all the time, but we do. I had a child stand up recently, a student up in Massachusetts where I was speaking. He stood up in the back of the room and he said, how do you know that human beings are more valuable than cats or squirrels or insects? I said, well, I'm going to get to a philosophical case later. I'm going to make a case more as I progress in this conversation. I said, but first, we have an intuitional knowledge. There's an intuition about our life, the way that we experience the life, the way that we understand it. And I said, I can point out to you really easily how you can experience that intuition. I said, you go into Home Depot and go find a wall where they got the gardening stuff. And there'll be a big, huge wall right there. And on that wall, it will say how to kill insects. And there'll be all sorts of different ways to kill insects. And I have never seen anyone, by the way, have a moral problem with that area. I've never seen them troubled by it. You never seen anybody stopping saying, is this something we should be doing, killing insects? This is awful. But what if the next section over was kill your neighbor's cats and dogs section? Well, you would probably have a different reaction to that. It's like, this is kind of weird. Oh, why is Home Depot trying to teach people to kill their neighbors' cats and dogs? And you actually see the moral transition begin at Home Depot as you move over and you'll have the rat traps. And they have humane rat traps. Why? Because we recognize there's something different about a cockroach and a rat. All the ways we got that transition, some people say kill them with, extreme justice and malice, destroy them. But other people are like, no, we should be nice to the rats because they're different than the cockroaches. There's no humane cockroach traps, but there are humane rat traps. So we're already having a moral crisis in between there. But what if the next section over was kill your neighbors section? Well, I think we would all be horrified. Why is Home Depot in the business of killing my neighbors? And why are they providing me the traps that I need and the poison that I need to do so? There's something deeply wrong here. You can see our moral intuitions into action as we work our way across here. You don't need a PhD to tell you that there's a difference in killing a cockroach and a human being. You understand that intuitionally. And so we have to make sense of the intuitions that we have. As J.P. Moreland says, they're not inerrant, they're not infallible, but they're where we begin our reasoning. How do we experience the world around us? How do we understand these things? We have to begin somewhere. I intuit that there's a difference. How do I explain those intuitions? And so we understand that there's a difference. As Greg Kokel says, if I were washing dishes and somebody walked in this room behind me, my daughter, and she said, Daddy, can I kill this? And my back's to her, I have to find out what before I answer the question. What is it? What does she have? If it's a bug, actually I'm going to say, yeah, go ahead and kill it. If it's the neighbor's cat, I hate that cat, but I'm still going to say no. If it's her little sister, absolutely not. What it is determines how I answer the question. And that is how we deal with these kinds of questions that we're talking about today, especially the issue of abortion. I'll be at a university, and they'll have someone representing the other side, and they will say things like this. They'll say, Mr. Watts, abortion must remain legal to protect women's equality rights in the society. Women must remain equal in the marketplace, and without abortion, they can't be. You see, women are unfairly impacted by pregnancy in a way that men are not. Men can walk around and be rogues and scoundrels and get people pregnant, and it'll never impact them. But if a woman gets pregnant, it severely impacts her life. Now, that's not an unimportant point. That's not trivial. It shouldn't be dismissed. But what does the question, what do the unborn have to do with that? As I respond to her, I don't say, or him, or whoever it is that I'm talking to, that I just don't think your point is important. I think it's really important. I have 2 young daughters. They're right now cavorting around Oxford because they got to go with me on this trip because this is my last trip of the year. I've been gone for 3 months, and my family is with me. I love my daughters deeply, and I want them to have the same opportunities that everybody else has in this world. And I want them to be able to find out what their talent, ability, intelligence, and willingness to work hard can produce in this world. I don't want them held back artificially by anything. So women's equality in the marketplace is an issue for which I have deeply invested interest. But this woman is making a mistake, or this man is making a mistake, or whoever I'm talking to has made a fundamental mistake. And I'm going to talk briefly about some of the fundamental mistakes that we make before I get on to making my case. They have done what we call presuppose the inhumanity of the unborn. And this goes beyond, by the way, the discussion of abortion. In almost everything, we operate on presuppositions. Every person in this room has already decided what they think about important issues before we ever start to talk about them. And they can corrupt our ability to look at those things objectively, to consider whether or not I'm wrong, because I should do that. It should enter my mind that I might be wrong and that I need to find out what somebody else believes. And so I have to watch out for how those presuppositions corrupt things. Here's how they corrupt this conversation. I agree with everything that that person said about the importance of equality in the marketplace. But I can ask this question back. Would you ever argue that to create an environment of equality in the marketplace for women, that we ought to be allowed to kill 2-year-old children? Would you ever argue that we ought to be allowed to kill 10-year-old children? Well, of course the answer is no. But why? Because they have already decided before they began to think about it what the unborn were, and it's corrupting the way they're arguing for it right now. They have a responsibility to demonstrate that the unborn human beings, or in this case, let's say elderly human beings that are starting to suffer from dementia, or anybody out there, is the kind of thing that we ought to be allowed to kill. That we don't have moral obligations or duties to them. They have a responsibility to demonstrate why that's the case. But when you abdicate that and just say, I'm not going to make that responsibility because I'm just going to claim at this point that women ought to be able to have that right, without doing that, you do what we call begging the question. You have assumed exactly what is your responsibility to demonstrate or prove in your argument. And so when you ask that question and they say no, I say, why? Well, because those people, those 10-year-olds, those 2-year-olds, those are human beings. So if the unborn are human in the same way that they are, in the same way that you and I are, we shouldn't be allowed to kill them for equality in the marketplace either. No matter how important it is, it doesn't justify the unjust taking of an innocent human life. We agree on that point. We use a tool we call Try Out the Toddler to demonstrate this to people. What happens, I remember speaking in California, a faculty member at a school that I was speaking at stood up in the back. He said, Mr. Watts, abortion must remain legal to protect women's privacy rights. They have a right to privacy. Really, people are often surprised to find out I'm an introvert. I don't like all the interaction all the time. If you left me alone, I'd be at home reading a book. There's like 5 things in the world I like to talk about, and if you're not talking about one of them, I'll sneak off into a corner and start reading and leave everybody else alone. These kind of things exhaust me. I just want to go home and sleep. So it's like, look, privacy is important for me as well. I agree. I like privacy. So, but here, and I stand up, I put my hand on my hip, and I said, but sir, I have a 2-year-old child standing next to me. This 2-year-old little girl is my next door neighbor. In the privacy of her own home, her father viciously abuses her every night. Her life is one ending abuse after another in the privacy of her own home. So would it be okay if we empowered the community through the police force to go into their house and check this child out to protect them? Well, what do you think he said? He said, yes, of course it would. I said, why? And he said, what do you mean, why? I said, why? It's happening in the privacy of their own home. You just said that privacy is important. I agree with you that privacy is important. Why should we be allowed to violate the privacy of this family to take this child out of that house? Well, I kept asking him why, and he kept trying to dodge the question. So finally he said to me after 3 or 4 attempts, privacy is not of a justification for the abuse of other human beings. And I said, all right, I agree with you. I don't think privacy is a justification for the abuse of human beings. And if the unborn are human in the same way that this child is, then we can't use privacy as an excuse for doing what we're doing to them as well. See, the question is not privacy. The question is not equality. The question is not poverty. All of those things are important to me as well. The question is, what are they? What gives us the right to do to them what we are doing to them at the rate that we're doing them to them? That is what has to be answered. And if we dodge that question, we're begging the question and just assuming that there's something that we can do that to. It's exactly her responsibility, as I tell the people that we're talking to. It is your responsibility to argue using science and philosophy that they're the kind of thing that we can do this to. And until you can demonstrate that, then they ought to be the kind of thing that we protect as they're included in the human family. Okay, the next mistake that we make, though, is something that Dr. Howe already talked at length about, so I'm just going to touch it very briefly. The idea that we take these kind of discussions and we drop them down to the level of preference claims, or what we call subjective claims. A subjective statement is about me, the subject. I give you information. I've mentioned several times today that I love bacon. I do deeply love bacon. I was at a hotel this week in Memphis that gave free bacon, and my wife texted me because I was sleeping in late because I've been speaking the night before, so I was tired, and she's like, Jay, there's a pound of bacon down here just waiting for somebody to come eat it. And I was down there in seconds. I mean, it doesn't matter how tired I am, there's bacon to be eaten. Now, that's not universally held position. As a matter of fact, I got through speaking in one place, and this woman came up afterwards, and she said, you know, you shouldn't eat bacon. I was like, well, why shouldn't you eat bacon? I don't understand that. She said, well, you know, we talked for a minute. Finally, she said, you know, pigs are smarter than dogs. I was like, oh, do you want me to eat dogs then? And she didn't think that was funny, but I did. And you know, she didn't care for that. But here's the thing. My love for bacon in no way obligates that woman to join me in that. I love bacon, I love Coke, I love apples, I love Reese's peanut butter cups. These are things that I love. Nobody in this room has to like any of them because I do, because those are subjective claims, subjective truth claims. I'm telling you something true about me, but it's not something objective. It's not something you have to agree on. An objective claim, the root word, obviously, object. Like this right here is an object. It doesn't matter how I feel about it. It doesn't matter what my emotional condition is towards it. It is what it is, independent of my feelings about it. And when I say that abortion is wrong, I'm making an objective claim. And people will say these things to me. They'll say, Mr. Watts, if you don't like abortion, then don't participate in it, don't have it. If you don't like these things, then don't do it. But those are your personal choices, your preferences. The key word there is like. I didn't say I didn't like any of the things that I talk about. I never said that I don't like abortion. I never said that I don't like eugenics. I never said that I don't like euthanasia. I never said I don't like the abuse of other human beings. What I said is it's wrong. It's objectively wrong. It doesn't matter whether it serves me, whether I like it, no matter how I feel about it. These are things that are wrong. And I'm not making the case that you shouldn't do it because I would prefer you not. I'm making the case that we shouldn't participate in it as a society because it's an objectively wrong thing to do. And there's other things that we accept as objectively. Hopefully, most people still do. There are rare people that I meet that call themselves pure subjectivists. I don't always believe them because I have conversations with them a lot to try to figure out what they're saying. But most of us still agree that there's such a thing as objective morality that governs our behavior, or that there's such things as objective wrongs. Most people don't think that rapists are okay committing rape because they like rape. Nobody's going to say, well, that guy likes rape. He prefers rape, so he should be allowed to do it. I wish he wouldn't, but who am I to say no? Why? Because we recognize that rape is a terrible moral evil. It's horrifyingly immoral. And it doesn't matter that there's something wrong with this guy that he thinks it's okay. That means there's something wrong with the way he is morally processing his act. We don't excuse him for his behavior. We recognize that his behavior is motivated either by a wrong understanding of morality, something wrong with his mind or how he processes things. There's something objectively wrong with him if he thinks that rape is okay. Imagine if you came to me and you said, hey, Jay, torturing toddlers for fun is wrong. And I respond to you, that may be wrong for you, but me and my family love to torture toddlers for fun. And every night we go out, we round up some toddler from the neighborhood, and we beat that guy all night. And keep your laws out of my house and off my body, please. You would say, well, there's something wrong with this guy. Because he should know that I meant that it's objectively wrong for all people at all times. Not that it's just wrong because I would prefer he not do it. It's the kind of thing that's wrong because it's wrong as a human being to do to another human being, and it applies to all people. That's why when we talk about, when you were talking about the Nuremberg trials, when we talk about, if you read Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, when we talk about getting Eichmann out of Argentina and bringing him back to Jerusalem, Eichmann said, hey, look, I was obeying the law. You have no right to prosecute me. I did everything legal. Hitler commanded me to do it. My supreme commander said that I should do what I did. You have no right to prosecute me. But we can look back at Eichmann and say there was something that you ought to have known beyond the laws of your land, that you shouldn't treat other human beings that way. If abortion is wrong, it's objectively wrong, and it falls into that category of wrongs. If it's not objectively wrong, it's not wrong at all. Those are two mistakes that people make, and in the interest of time, I want to move on because I want to open up the floor for questions prior to get done. So we make a couple of mistakes. One of them, and there's more that we could go on to, but two of them are that we beg the question, we assume what the unborn are before we ever talk about it. And we make that mistake not just in this issue, but in all other issues. And the other thing is that we make a mistake of understanding the difference between objective and subjective claims. Now let's get to me making my case, because I have a responsibility to make a case that human life matters. And again, we're going to build on some of what you've already heard today. Now I use science and philosophy. Now I am unapologetically Christian. I am without apology deeply committed as a Christian, and I do not hide it. I don't make any effort to try to keep that somewhere hidden in the back. It comes out all the time in my talks. I express it constantly because I live by the grace and glory of Jesus Christ, and it is by that way that I changed from the person that I was to the man that I am today, and every good thing that I have in my life, I attribute to the relationship that I have with God and his guiding in my life. But when I go out and I have the opportunity to speak at universities and they ask for me to make a case for life, I don't use the Bible. I don't talk about Jeremiah 1, I think chapter 1, verses 5, where he talks about I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. I don't go to Psalm 139, where he talks about the idea that you knit me together in my mother's womb. Your works are wonderful. We know that well. I don't go to Luke chapter 1, verse 41, where Elizabeth and Mary come together, and Elizabeth has presumably a fetal John the Baptist inside of her, and Mary has presumably an embryonic Jesus inside of her, and John the Baptist leaps as a fetus at the presence presence of his Lord, because even though he was an unborn fetus, and even though Jesus was just an embryo, it is the nature of the personality of John the Baptist to leap at the presence of his Lord. And Jesus is Lord as an embryo, as he was as a fetus, as a child, as an adult, all the way through, the same being. But I would never point to those things, even though they're meaningful to me, because it would immediately drop whatever I was saying back down into the realm of personal preference. They would say, well, that's your personal opinion, your personal religious beliefs. Why should they impact me? And that's a fair question. Why should they impact them? And I have a limited amount of time to make my case. And so we use science and philosophy, but I tell people all over the country, they get a little nervous about this. Science and philosophy is not leaving God behind. If he is God, and if he is Lord of all, then he is the Lord of science and the Lord of philosophy as well. I cannot leave him out of this conversation. All disciplines of intellectual inquiry will constantly point back to that reality. And so I don't have to fear using science and philosophy. What I'm doing is using something that hopefully the people I'm talking to will accept as common ground, and we'll be able to talk to each other. So what about the science? So it might surprise you people to hear this, but there is very little debate actually about the science of what I'm about to say. From the moment that we come into existence, from the moment the fertilization process is over, the science of embryology tells us we are distinct, living, and whole human beings. Distinct, living, and whole human beings from the moment the fertilization process has occurred. We are distinct, living, and whole. We are distinct. We are unlike any cell in the body of our mother or father. We are living. We respond to stimuli. We have cellular reproduction. We have metabolism, which means basically we're growing. It means that we respond to people poking at us, with electrical impulses or pins or things like that. And it means that we are eating. We're consuming as metabolism. We have all of the things necessary to be considered living, and we are whole. We are not a part of something else. Now, somebody may look at you and say, well, hey, skin cells are living, and skin cells have a whole genetic code within them, so why don't you get all upset every time a skin cell dies or any other living cell dies? Why that one particular single cell thing with its own genetic structure is more important than another single cell with a whole genetic structure in it? Well, that key comes as a whole. It's a whole human being, not a part. That's a confusion of parts and wholes. You see, from the moment I came into existence, when I was a single cell, no bigger than a period on a piece of paper, all of the things that were genetically determined by me were there, but they had to be expressed through the maturation process. What you see relative, if you can, I assume with the lighting, you can probably see some glare on the top of my head. I'm not as bald as some men, but I don't have the hair that I once had. When I was in my 20s, I was a hippie. I had more hair than Jeremy does right now. You know, I look at Jeremy, that glorious head of hair, and I'm jealous of that because I used to have it. I had no idea that this was coming, by the way. I mean, it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s, early 30s, that suddenly I realized my hairline was retreating. And, you know, I fought it, the idea. I was like, oh, I'm just wearing too many hats. I'm pulling my hair back too much in a ponytail. But then one day I just had to shave my head to fear I was going to look like Hulk Hogan if I didn't. It's like the baldness was always there. It was a part of me. It's a reaction that was there from the moment I came into existence. What happened is that over enough time in my maturation, it got to be seen. My daughter, who was 10 years old, who I mentioned earlier, I think, MJ, who was right now dancing around Oxford, she was diagnosed at 8 as a type 1 diabetic. And the doctor walked into the room while we were sitting in the emergency room, and he said, there's something you need to know. There's nothing that you did that caused this. It's who she was. It's been there from the moment that she came into existence. It's a part of her nature, part of her genetic structure. That means that for 8 years of my life, I lived with a diabetic daughter. I always, from the moment she's come into existence, had a diabetic daughter. But it wasn't until she was 8, until she had matured enough and that genetic expression had been realized in her in front of me, that I found out. It was always there. What I found out was not something that was added to her. What I found out was something further about the nature of the child that I had. She was a diabetic from the time that she was there. So we're not talking about things when we talk about living organisms as whole organisms. We have this internally coordinated, internally growing thing. So we're not a part of anything. We're a whole in and of ourselves, even though we're geographically located inside the woman. So we're whole, distinct, and living from the moment we come into existence. And I said this isn't really debated much anywhere. As a matter of fact, it's so easy to understand that we were sitting around the dinner table one night, and this was about 18 months ago, I guess, and it was my 10-year-old son at the time, my 8-year-old daughter, and my 5-year-old daughter, I think were their ages. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in the middle of dinner, my son looks up, and he's like, hey, Mom, did you know that inside the woman's body there's a cell called a sperm? Inside the man's body, there's a cell called a sperm. And inside the woman's body, there's a cell called an egg. And when these two guys get together, that's how human life begins. And my wife shoots me a look, I guess because of what I do for a living, that this is how my fault, and I decided to have this conversation with my 10-year-old son before dinner. It's like, I had nothing to do with this. And she's like, okay. She said, Peyton, I did know that, but how do you know that? And Peyton said, well, I was in Daddy's study area and there was an anatomy book on the shelf and I got it down and I started flipping through it. And I read that and he said, I just thought that was fascinating. He's like, I don't want you guys to worry about it though. It only happens like once a month, so it's not going to happen all the time or anything. We're like, hey, thanks, Peyton. I appreciate that, man. We were worried for a second there, but you put us at ease. My 10-year-old son pulls an anatomy book, okay? This isn't a Christian anatomy book. This isn't a pro-life anatomy book. It's just an anatomy book. The science of this is industry. Here's a quote from Peter Singer in his book, Practical Ethics, 2nd edition. He says, it is possible to give human being a precise meaning. We can use it as equivalent to a member of the species Homo sapiens. Whether a being is a member of a given species is something that can be determined scientifically by an examination of the nature of the chromosomes and the cells of living organisms. In this sense, there is no doubt that from the first moments of its existence, an embryo conceived from human sperm and eggs is a human being. Here's a quote from Dr. Michelin Matthews Roth from the Harvard Medical School. So therefore, it is scientifically correct to say that an individual human life begins at conception when egg and sperm join to form the zygote. And this developing human always is a member of our species in all stages of its life. I used to carry 8 pages of quotes from pro-choice philosophers, pro-choice advocates, people who disagree with me about the issues I'm talking about today, and all of them agreeing and affirming what I just said. Almost nobody argues that we're not human beings from the moment that we come into existence, and we're not human beings during the entire course of our life. So what are we arguing about? Does it matter? What makes human beings valuable? That's kind of the nature of what we were talking about earlier. Essentialism, nature, conversations about that. Where does that value come from? Now, I want to briefly say, I never told my kids for years what I did for a living because I wanted them to have childhoods and I didn't want them to know the worst things about the world right from the beginning. I have friends that raise their kids in these radically pro-life houses and take them to marches and show them the pictures and things like that. I'm not judging them. That's just not what my family and I did. But as a result of that, my family had no idea what I did for a living most of my life. My kids didn't. And I used to work at a pregnancy resource center. If you don't know what those are, and I'm on the board of directors of this particular one still, it's a place where when families and women are facing crisis pregnancies, we would just pour out resources into their life, classes to help them overcome the problems they were in, give them free medical care, and do everything that we could to help them make what we consider to be life-affirming choices. And my son would come and visit me there, and he didn't know what I did. And we had these little models, like 12-week rubber fetuses, that would show people what they looked like at 12 weeks of development because 90% of abortions happen about 12 to 8 weeks, somewhere in there. And so he would grab those, and he'd start playing with them like toys. He's like, woo-hoo-hoo! He'd start running around the halls, flying with them. And I was like, you're freaking the moms out. Please stop that. And I would go home, and he'd be like hitting his toys over the head with his fetus. And I was like, please stop doing that, man. That's weird. And he's like, no, Dad, it's Superboy. I was like, no, it's a fetus, and that's strange. He came home from church one day, and he's like, hey, Dad, somebody asked me what you did for a living at church today. I said, I don't know. I think he sells babies. I was like, oh, no. I was like, oh. I've got a lot of questions waiting for me when I go back to church now because of my son. Okay, so my son walks in, and he sees me working, reading. And he says, what you reading, Dad? I'm reading a book called Embryo by Robert George. And he says, what's it about? Well, he was 6 at the time, so I don't want to tell him the details of what I'm reading. I don't want to burden him with that. But it's about what we're talking about today, that human life begins and it has value from beginning to end by virtue of what it is. And so I tried to figure out a way that I can talk to him about it. So I have a dry erase marker. And I take the dry erase marker and I walk up to a mirror right behind me and I do a line segment on that. And I say, this line segment, son, represents your life. From beginning to end, came into existence the time that you die. And I put a little line up there. So here you are at 6 years old. Put another one up. Here you are at 10. Put one up. Here you are at 30. Here you are at 60. All the different points of your life. Okay, so let me ask you a question. At 6, you're living right now. So at 10, you're going to be bigger, smarter. You have different capacities and abilities, different responsibilities in the house. Will you still be the same person? Even though all those things will change, will you still be the same person? My 6-year-old son says, yeah, I think so. We say, okay, let's go to the next one, 30. Let me tell you something about 30 years old. By the time you go from 10 to 30, every cell in your body will have changed over. You'll be materially made of different stuff. Different materials making up your body. You'll have entirely different capacities, entirely different abilities. Different rights will have been conferred upon you by our government. Different expectations in your communities. You may have adapted different roles in life. You may just be, you're a son and a brother now, but you may be a father and a husband then, and have other jobs that you're going to have. So all of these things will have changed. And I promise you at 30, you won't be living in my house anymore, so you'll be living somewhere else. That will have changed as well. I said, so with all of these changes, though, are you still the same person? Is it still you? Does it make sense to look at the course of your life and say that was you? What happened to 6 and 10-year-old happened to you? Are you the same person? He said, yeah, I think so. 60, again, everything's changed. Still the same person? Even though you're 60 and everything about your life is entirely different than it was at 30, 10, and 6, can you look back at the course of your life and say that the things that happened, like I can at 43, looking back at my life, and I say, when I was 6, I broke this arm. Over the next 3 years, I broke this arm three times. Over the course of my life, I have broken every finger, I've broken every toe, I've broken my feet, I had my nose broken and my skull cracked in a Taekwondo fight. I look over the course of my life and I say, all of those things happened to me, this person. Do you maintain that identity throughout that lifetime? And he said, yeah, I think so. I said, let's go backwards. You came home from it as a newborn. Newborns can't do anything. If you have experience with them, you know that. They just lay there, they eat, they sleep. They don't even cry that much. They go to the bathroom. It doesn't bother me. You know, my kids would open their eyes and be like, woo, call grandma. They open their eyes, film it quickly. But they're not really doing anything. They just lay there. It's like your kid couldn't do anything. I said, you couldn't do anything, but was that you? Did I bring you home from the hospital? Did I bring Peyton home? Or did I bring some other thing that would later become Peyton? And he said, no, I think you brought me home. I said, okay. So let's go back to 20 weeks. And I got out a picture of an ultrasound. Nose, chin, head, hands. I can see all of that at 20 weeks inside your mother. Is that a picture of you? Or is it a picture of something that became you? Some human life that would later become Peyton. He said, well, if that was me, then I think it's me. I said, all right, let's go back to the moment of conception. My 6-year-old son said, I have no idea what conception is. Like, well, we'll talk about that some other time. I said, but you come into existence, you're a single-celled organism, no bigger than a period on a piece of paper. Did your life begin at that point? Does that make sense to say that? Your life began at that point. Or do you begin later? And he said, I think I began at that point. I said, okay, this is what we're talking about. Notice everything. Everything changes. From the moment we come into existence to the time that we die, everything about us changes. But if there is such a thing as universal human value, if there's such a thing as it makes sense for us to say that what the Nazis did were wrong, if it makes sense to say what happened between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda was wrong, if we can judge Pol Pot for what he did in Cambodia, if we can look at other cultures and say, you can't treat your people like that, no matter what the laws of your land say, and no matter what you believe, then there must be something universally true of all of us. But even in the course of one single lifetime, there's nothing universally true about me, except one thing: what I am. My human nature is the only thing that unifies that being from beginning to end. It's the only thing that makes sense that I can look through the course of the life and say I stayed the same person throughout it. You can just abandon that if you want and say, well, you didn't stay the same person without it. But then all of our intuitions about how the world works are out. The criminal justice system makes no sense whatsoever any longer. Because if I haven't stayed the same person throughout my entire life, what sense does it make to keep punishing me for something that some other being did? I have to be the same person for the way that we live our life to make sense, for the intuitions by which we live to make sense. And what unifies me is my human nature. And so when I ask somebody on a campus, I ask this question as a diagnostic, so would it be objectively wrong for me to kill you right now? You, sir, would it be objectively wrong for me to kill you right now? Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. It would be objectively wrong for me to kill you. If he answers yes, I learned something about him. Even if he disagrees with me about almost every other question about how we should treat other human beings in regards to life on the edges, especially when we're talking about abortion, if he says yes, then I know something about him. He believes in objective moral values. He believes in duties. He believes we have responsibilities and duties to other human beings, even though we don't know each other. We've never met, and I haven't seen you. I still can't kill you just because I want to. Because you're the kind of thing that I shouldn't kill, even though you have nothing to do with my life. And we agree on all of that. So what do we disagree on? The nature of the life that we're talking about. You see, some people want to draw a line through humanity because they accept that line segment that I gave you and say from the moment it begins to the moment it ends, it's all humanity. But what they want to do is they want to draw a line through it and say some people are merely human. Some beings are merely human, and some beings are persons. And persons have rights. Persons have value, and humans do not. And when I ask the next question I ask them, I say, what changed? What changed from the fetus or embryo that you once were that it would have been okay to kill you then? Legally protected right. But if I killed you now in this more mature form, well, I'd get in all kinds of trouble for it. And they give me one of 4 answers. And Stephen Schwartz calls it the SLED acronym: size, level of development, environment, or degree of dependency. Size, level of development, environment, or degree of dependency. One of those answers is going to be what they give me. And then we argue philosophically, because the science tells us that we're human beings, and we almost all agree on that. So the question is, what gives us value? So we say philosophically, neither size, level of development, environment, or degree of dependency will ever do enough work to justify what we could do to you then, but I can't do to you today. You changed in size, but size isn't a value-giving property. We don't look at big people and say, look how big that guy is. He must be very valuable. It'd be very wrong to kill that guy. His body is huge. It holds so much value. Just like I hope you don't look at little people and by, look how little that person is. They're so little value. Their little bodies just can't hold it. It's so sad. No, we don't look at human beings like that. But size is what we call a degreed property. You have some, it grows. You once were a single cell, unless you're an identical twin, you might have been a little bigger than that. But you once were a single cell, now you're larger. You will get smaller if you age long enough. These size changes don't change your value because value is what we call intrinsic. You either have it or you don't. Level of development. Well, we'll say there's something that you need to be able to do to be considered a valuable human being. A level that you need to reach. A capacity that you have to have. Size doesn't do it, but sure, level of development does it. And I hear this more than anything. And the development marker changes. They'll say, some people say heartbeat, some people will say brain waves. Heartbeat's 20 days after conception, brain waves 6 weeks. Some people say organized cortical brain activity, somewhere about 28 weeks. Some people will say the ability to feel pain, somewhere about 20 weeks after conception. What you hear more than anything is conscious awareness. You have to be consciously aware. You have to be aware that you're alive for me to take something from you that matters. So, first of all, what they have done is they've drawn a line again through humanity and said that you must be able to do X, whatever it is, to be considered a person. And if you're not a person, there's nothing wrong that I can do to you because you have no value, you have no rights. The problem with the conscious awareness argument, and it's argued by Peter Singer, who I mentioned earlier, Michael Tooley, Marianne Warren, various other people have argued this on an academic level, is that consciousness isn't attained until several months after birth, depending on how you define it, even up to several years. So do these people argue that we ought to be able to kill newborns? Yes, they do. They say that there's nothing morally wrong in and of itself in killing newborns. As a matter of fact, there were 2 issues of the Journal of Medical Ethics just a year and a half ago that were both argued for what they call after-birth abortions. They said, look, abortion is a word that's accepted. Abortion is a word that people are comfortable with. So let's argue, instead of infanticide, that you should be able to take your children home from the hospital. That you should be able to, if they have a genetic abnormality that expresses itself that you don't want to live with, take them back to the hospital and have them painlessly and mercifully killed. And instead of calling it infanticide, let's call it after-birth abortions. And the second issue, they let all of these different philosophers respond to it. About half the philosophers still said that we shouldn't do it. Half the philosophers said that we should be considering it. Only Robert George, Catholic philosopher, and one of my living heroes, had the shortest article in response to all of this, because his article said this: this is madness. You're talking about killing newborns as if that's medical treatment. This is madness. And this is the Journal of Medical Ethics. We have moved out of the ivory tower and we've now put it into a journal whose sole purpose is to advise doctors how to treat their patients. This is madness. And Peter Singer's response philosophically is, no, it's not. Let's get back to the E, size, level of development. Let's go to E, environment, because Peter Singer's response is, if it's okay to kill them here, right here inside their mother, then it's okay to kill them here, right outside their mother, because nothing changed about the kind of being it was. It has maintained exactly the same thing it was from here to here. And if you say it's okay to kill them there, then it's okay to kill them here, because 8-inch trip down the birth canal doesn't magically transform it into something that we ought to protect. And by the way, Peter Singer's right. He's just wrong about what we ought to be doing with our newborns. I agree with him. If we shouldn't kill newborns, and I believe we should not, then we shouldn't kill them simply because they are not yet born and they happen to be there. Where you are doesn't determine the kind of thing that you are and whether or not you have value. It's just a geographical fact. And college students, by the way, are getting more and more comfortable with this argument, and they're making it all the time. I don't believe them, but they stand in front of me and they say, there's nothing wrong with killing newborns. There's nothing morally wrong with killing newborns. I asked this young man just recently, are you telling me if I put an onion on this table and a newborn child on that table, and I took a knife and started working my way through the onion, and then come to the next table and work my way through the newborn child, that those two actions are morally equivalent? They both lack any moral nature whatsoever. I've done the exact same kind of thing. And he said, well, in order to be consistent in my views, I have to say yes. I said, or you could just not be consistent in your views and change them. Because almost any rational moral person would be able to tell the difference between these two things, and there is no virtue in that kind of vicious consistency. You don't become some virtuous intellectual by willing to accept what all reasonable people ought to know is a wrong, simply to be consistent with a view that all of our intuitions tell us there's something wrong with. But But environment doesn't give us that. So finally, degree of dependence. The degree of dependence, they say, well, there's something about them that's so dependent that they have less value than they had before. Okay, as I mentioned, that my daughter was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. One Sunday morning, she was radically independent. One Monday morning, we're in the hospital, and she's radically dependent on insulin for the rest of her life. Every meal choice that she makes, we have to wake her up in the middle of the night to make sure she doesn't drop down into a diabetic coma and die. Radically dependent right now until they cure diabetes, which is actually a possibility, or at least manage it in such a way it's almost miraculous in the next 10 years. But her life of dependence grew. Did it become a lesser offense to kill her because of the increase of dependence? The reason it says degree of dependence is because we are all dependent. Each and every one of us dependent by nature. None of us can live. So somebody gets to decide at what level you become so dependent that you're no longer a person. At this level of dependence, you cease to be a person and you become a non-personal human life. And to that being, there is nothing wrong that I can do. Who gets to make that decision? And that extends all the way to the other end of life, because right now we're having that conversation as we're talking about the elderly or the people who are sick or the people, and this is going on in the Netherlands and Belgium and Washington State and Oregon and all over our culture, is we're trying to decide who ought to be able to live and die. And I'm not talking about just letting them die. We're talking about actively killing people because they reach a level of dependence so great that their life no longer matters. And this isn't lost, by the way, on handicapped advocate communities and disabled advocate communities. They look at this and they say they're terrified at the current trends of U.S. ethical thought and world thought because they see themselves as targets. Degree of dependence, at what level? And this, I want to end, Christopher Kaiser says this. He says, you can draw a line. All throughout humanity, we have drawn a line through human name, and we've said that those people matter and those people don't. All throughout our history, we have drawn a line and said that these people are valuable and these people are not. He said we did it all throughout our history. And Christopher Kaiser, a Catholic philosopher at Loyola Marymount, says this: every other time we have drawn a line through humanity and said those people don't matter, we have done the worst imaginable things to them. Every single time we've said, they're not like me, we have done awful things to them. And every single time we have matured morally to realize we never should have done that. We were wrong, and we never should have behaved that way. So we ask this question: what are the chances? What are the chances that we are finally right? What are the chances that we have finally found individuals, human life, that we are justified in treating the way that we are? What are the chances that even though every other time we've been wrong, that we're finally correct? Not good. And I know I'm right up on the end of my time. I just want to say this very quickly. How we talk about this matters. It's a deeply personal issue. I was at St. Louis University recently, and I was talking to a young lady, and she was struggling emotionally with this conversation. And as I kept talking and graciously reaching out to her and trying to, she said this. She said, just weeks ago, I drove my friend to the abortion clinic. She got an abortion, I took her home, and I took care of her. I'm personally against abortion, but I can't tell other people what to do. Her emotion was because as I'm talking about this thing as being an injustice, she senses that I'm judging not just her friend, but her. And she said, my friend is a good person, and I'm a good person. I don't want to judge anybody. I was once a rotten, horrible human being who lived a horrible life. I have no interest in judging anybody else. And I don't need you or anybody else to make me feel worse about the man that I was. And I wish I had enough forgiveness for me that I could forgive myself the way that God has. But that isn't going to happen this side of heaven. And so when I go out and tell people that these things are wrong, and I want to confront what I believe to be injustice in this society, and I argue using science and philosophy, and I pose the question, what are the unborn? What is humanity? And why should we be able to do the things that we're doing to one another? Why shouldn't we obligate ourselves to treat people as if they had dignity by virtue of what they are, not what they can do for me, or not what happiness they produce in society? As I pose these questions, I'm not doing it to make people feel bad. I believe in the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. I believe that we're saved through his blood and there are none righteous, no, not one. That is the conviction that drives my life, and it is the way that I understand why I'm a better man than I once was. But what are you supposed to do in the face of injustice? When you believe something genuinely awful is happening, I cannot be terrified that saying something will make you feel judged. So I have to do it in such a way that reaches out with the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ, and it can be done because two things people say to me all the time when I get done talking to them at campuses is, thank you. Even when they disagreed, thank you for coming and talking about this. Thank you for being here. I get hugs from people on the other side all the time. I'm a huge hugger. I love hugging. I'm not going to try to force anybody in this room to hug me. People freak out when I say that. Hugging you non-huggers is like hugging some unnatural tree. I don't enjoy it. But I love hugging other huggers, okay? And so I get huge hugs from the other side. They say, thank you for coming and talking about this. And here's another thing that surprises me often. The number one question that I get when I open up the floor to students is not about abortion. Because I present the hopefully with such grace and respect, because it would be a hypocrite if I went out spreading a message that all people have value and ought to be treated as beings with dignity and hated the people who disagreed with me. It would be a vile hypocrite. But hopefully I present it in such a gracious way. The first question they ask me is, so why are you a Christian? Talk to me about what made you a Christian. What changed your view on all of that? We can argue so well about the most divisive issues that at the end of the day, people say, what made you what you are? It can be done. And I will be around all day, so if you have questions, hunt me down. I know I'm over my time, and I apologize for that. Thank you, Jeremy, for the opportunity to come, and thank you guys for listening. I appreciate the audience.
Thank you, Jay. In order to bring you so many presenters and presentations and fit it all in one day, we have to adhere to a tight schedule. So I apologize if there are sessions in which we don't have time for Q&A. Two things about that. First of all, if there is time, we'll provide